Well, perfect. A warm welcome and thank you all for joining us here today in person and on the web. My name is Caitlin McCarthy and I'm the Director of the Associates Program at the Environmental Law Institute. You have joined us for Environmental Justice in the 21st Century, Threats and Opportunities, a collaboration between the Environmental Law Institute, ABA Section of Civil Rights and Social Justice, and the Program on Environmental and Energy Law at American University Washington College of Law, with generous support by Beveridge and Diamond. Before I discuss our logistics, etc. for today, I do want to give a chance for Amanda to wish you all a warm welcome. She's been such a great partner here, and we've just loved working together with her.
Thanks. So I am a professor here at AU and the director of our program on environmental and energy law. And in addition to fetching water to the speakers, I wanted to just say thanks to everyone for joining what I hope will be a wonderful conversation. So we look forward to hosting you here, and then as you'll hear in a minute, there will be a reception after the event in the atrium.
Great. So we're also so grateful for our student volunteers who've been great today and checking you all in, our coordinators here at the law school, and of course my ELI colleagues, Colin and Lavinia, who are running the tech and coordinating today. So building on the pivotal discussions from part 1 and 2 of this series, part 3 today will feature a discussion led by the co-authors of the 1987 UCC report, Charles Lee and Bernice Miller-Travis, as well as leading professors Ezra Rosser and William Snape. Moderated by Kendra Brown, these knowledgeable experts will explore the progress made and the current and future challenges facing environmental justice communities. We'll conclude the panel with a question and answer session. During Q&A, we will start with questions from our online participants, and then we will open up this room for questions. For our audience members on GoToWebinar, we encourage you to ask a question by submitting it through GoTo's question box, and please do not hold your questions until the end. Send them as soon as you think of them. For our audience members in the room, my colleague Lavinia and I will be running around with these mics, and you'll be able to ask a question then. Immediately after today's panel, please join us in the atrium. We will have a catered reception made possible by the incredible support of Beveridge and Diamond, with a special thanks to Stacy Sublet. We do have longer bios listed on our website, eli.org, but I would highly encourage you to check out our outstanding panelists. I would like to take a moment to briefly introduce the moderator of today's panel, Kendra Brown. Kendra currently serves as the Senior Director for Diversity, Inclusion, and Affinity here at Washington College of Law at American University. She is a member of American University's President's Council on Diversity and Inclusion. Previously, Kendra has served as the Deputy Chief of Staff and Legislative Director in the House of Representatives, Policy Director of the Congressional Black Caucus in the House of Representatives, and she's also the former National Chair of the National Black Law Students Association, and she's also been the Legislative Counsel for Earth Justice. Kendra graduated from Hampton University with a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science with a minor in Business Management. She then earned her Master of Divinity at Howard University's Divinity School and received her law degree from Vermont Law School. Additionally, Kendra attended the George Washington University School of Law for her Master of Laws. She is deeply committed to community engagement and empowerment as both a member and leader of several groups. We are so grateful to have her here today to moderate, and I would like to turn things over to her to introduce today's topic, as well as her co-panelists. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here with everyone, and we have a wonderful program in store for each and every one of you. I am surrounded by some amazing individuals as far as environmental justice is concerned, the leading experts and the faculty who are just really going to shed light on where we currently are as far as environmental justice is concerned. We still know that there's so much further that we have to go, and so we're just going to dive right in, and I'm going to introduce our amazing panelists, and I'm starting with Mr. Charles Lee, who is to my left. He is an amazing Senior Policy Advisor at the Office of Environmental Justice at the Environmental Protection Agency. Previously, he served as the Director of the Office of Environmental Justice, and before that, he was the Director of Environmental Justice Programs at the United Church of Christ for 15 years. In 1987, as you have already heard, the United Church of Christ released a report entitled Toxic Waste and Race in the United States, of which Lee was the principal author. This report has been described as groundbreaking and as the first report to use rigorous analysis and methods to show how pollution and environmental hazards were disproportionately affecting minority and low-income communities. So we do welcome you, Mr. Lee. So I'm going to introduce everyone first, and then we're going to hear from them in turn. Next, we will have Ms. Bernice Miller-Travis. She has worked for more than 30 years to help build the field of environmental justice and to help grow and shape the environmental justice movement across the United States. She is also the co-founder of West Harlem Environmental Action, WEACT, now known as WEACT for Environmental Justice, a 30-year-old community-based environmental justice advocacy organization based in the West Harlem community of New York City. She has worked as a civil rights advocate at the United Church of Christ Commission for Racial Justice and the Center for Constitutional Rights, and an environmental advocate at the Natural Resources Defense Council and Groundwork USA. She is particularly an expert in the historical factors of racial segregation as predeterminants for environmental injustice in present-day manifestations of racial segregation in land use, zoning, and development practices in urban communities. So we also welcome you. Professor Ezra Rosser, to my left, he joined the Washington College of Law faculty in 2006. He has taught property, federal Indian law, poverty law, land use, and housing law. He is a co-author of a textbook entitled Poverty Law, Policy, and Practice, and was a co-editor of the Poverty Law Canon and Tribes, Land, and the Environment. He is currently working on a sole-authored book entitled Exploiting the Fifth World, Navajo Land and Economic Development. So we welcome you. Professor Bill Snape, to my right, is a fellow and practitioner in residence at American University Washington College of Law, as well as the Assistant Dean of Adjunct Faculty Affairs. He's also senior counsel for the Center for Biological Diversity, where he works on endangered species, public lands, and energy issues. He is the co-producer of Hot Air, a radio podcast show on global warming policy and regulation. He has also litigated a number of environmental and related cases in federal court and argued Center for Biological Diversity versus Interior, which rejected the federal government's plan for oil and gas drilling off of the coast of Alaska in part because of climate change concerns. He is a master's swimmer and water polo player and has coached at both the Division I and Division III levels of college swimming. He continues to advise both the U.S. Deaf Swimming and Gallaudet University on various matters relating to deaf athletics. So we are so grateful to have all of our panelists here this evening, and we are going to start first with Mr. Lee, and he will share a history of the environmental justice movement, as well as comments on the impacts of the 1987 report and current challenges in environmental justice. So I welcome you. Yes.
So, great. Thank you. Thank you, Professor Brown, and it's really a pleasure to be here tonight. And I want to thank the Environmental Law Institute and the ABA section on Civil Rights and Social Justice and the program on environmental and energy law at American University College of Law for inviting me here. It's really a pleasure to speak with all of you, and I think that I want to share a history in a snapshot, so this is going to be pretty hard to do. But before I start, I want to give a shout out to Carolyn Larkham. And I'm not sure if Carolyn's in the room, but there's a special connection between Carolyn and me, myself. She was my law intern at the Office of Environmental Justice several years ago. She was an an outstanding law intern. And like many of you here, I think she's a rising star and a future leader of the legal profession. The first slide, okay, I want to start is what is environmental justice, and this slide provides several definitions, one of which is the U.S. EPA's around fair treatment and meaningful involvement, and the other is from Professor Bunyan Bryant, which talks about societal norms and sustainability. He, of course, he was at the School of Natural Resources at the University of Michigan. I think Bunyan was a little bit, he kind of forecasted the future because that school is now called the University of Michigan School of Environment and Sustainability. On the bottom is a set of component parts of a taxonomy of environmental justice. There's no time this evening to go through them, but I just want to say, I point this out to you because, as law students, this is something you will be most interested in. So next slide. I want to step back a little bit and just explain to you what this slide is in terms of this quote from Dr. Martin Luther King in terms of the arc of the moral universe being long but it bends towards justice. So several years ago, I got to I realized when I gave the talk on the history of environmental justice, I would kind of give it in terms of a big overall sweep of events, like what happened in the 1980s, 90s, 2000s, et cetera, right? And then I realized that, when you start to look at the history of environmental justice, there was so much material that you can take some of these events and some of these iconic events and then trace things that grew out of that directly that flow from them. And this is a kind of a different way, I thought, of looking at EJ history, and I think for a lot of reasons, very a lot more insightful and very and actually pretty empowering. And I'll come back to this slide at the end. So the first event that I wanted to talk about in terms of iconic event that gave birth to environmental justice in the United States is Warren County, North Carolina in 1982. This is the event where 500 people, lay down in front of PCB or polychlorinated biphenyl contaminated soil, and to try to stop it from being shipped to a landfill being sited in the county that was one of the poorest and had the highest percentage of African Americans populations in the state. This is Warren County has been pointed to as the event that kind of gave spark to the modern environmental justice movement in the U.S. Like Kirschmelk, this is the quote there, said, "Environmental justice is the convergence of two great social movements of the latter part of the 20th century, civil rights and environmentalism." But most people have never kind of looked at what happened in Warren County afterwards, what happened as a result of the protests and so on and so forth. And this is important because, when you talk about environmental justice, you talk about what happens in communities. And so understanding what happens in communities, as all these big events are taking place is really important. So the first thing that happened that as a result of the protest there was the fact that African Americans, Dolly Burwell, who was herself arrested 5 times, said, African Americans determine henceforth and forevermore that they will be in control of their own destinies. And so that meant that they needed to be involved in the political process. And so right after the Warren County protests, the elections for the county commission made for the first time ever gave it a black majority. And one of those people there is in the first picture on the there is Eva Clayton, who she became the first African American woman to become a U.S. representative from the area. And then I think there's a long history there, but I'm not going to go into it. But it is now, suffice it to say, that Warren County is probably one of the most politically active counties in the state of North Carolina today. The second thing that happened there, which everyone predicted would happen, was that the landfill was going to leach. And so it did, and the state had to figure out what to do with it. And so there was a long process, and they brought together citizens from North Carolina to advise the process. And the Warren County citizens insisted, even though it was not the cheapest option, that the soil be detoxified on site. And I want to just kind of take you back to a conversation I had when I went down there in 1982 with residents there, when they told me that, well, perhaps the best thing to do with the soil is to ship it to this landfill they heard about, the chemical waste management landfill in Email, Alabama. And we had a conversation about how that was in the Alabama Black Belt and a community just like theirs. And so the reason they decided that they needed to detoxify on site was because, they did not want this to happen to another community just like theirs. Now, that's a pretty incredible statement for them to make. So a couple years ago, there was the 30th anniversary celebration of the Warren County protest in Coley Spring Baptist Church, as Patricia me speaking there. And one of the things that happened there, it's kind of history had to come full circle. The state of North Carolina unveiled a historical marker plaque to put on the highway near the landfill that honored the Warren County protest as something that was historic and led to the national environmental justice movement. So that was the first thing. The second one that I want to talk about in terms of an iconic event is, of course, Toxic Waste and Race. And I'll spend a little bit more time on this. I guess, this is a picture of us, the United Church of Christ Commission for Racial Justice, releasing the report at the National Press Club on April 15th, 1987. And I guess, there's a lot of notable things about this picture, but the most memorable one for me is the fact that my hair was still black. But going back, there's a direct flow from Warren County, because shortly after the Warren County incident, Congressman Wilbert Fauntleroy, who was the delegate from the District of Columbia, and at that time the chair of the Congressional Black Caucus, asked the government county office, now the Governmental Accountability Office, for a study on these demographics of landfills in the South. And they did, and they found 3 out of the 4 in the Southeast, the 8 states in EPA Region 4, to be dominantly African American communities. And I got this idea that, in order to put this issue on the map, both literally and figuratively, we needed to replicate that study. And so, and I won't go into all the details about how that came about and things like that, but suffice it to say, that's what led to toxic waste and race in the United States. And I don't think there's enough time to go into all the details about the study, other than they found, among other things, the fact that race was the factor that was most determinative in terms of where the facilities in question were going to be located. So what it did was lead to a cascade of events that I will start at the bottom with. The first is the fact that shortly thereafter, the report sparked the attention of Bunyan and Professor Paul Mohai at the University of Michigan, and they organized the first academic conference on race and the incidence of environmental hazards. You should know that now You know, there are, I would say, thousands of peer-reviewed journal articles on environmental justice, on disproportionate environmental impacts. There are hundreds of university courses on this subject. There are just incredible amounts of scholarship in all different kinds of areas. And there's even a PhD program on environmental justice at the University of Michigan School of Natural Resources. So, so that's just a snapshot. The second thing is that it has led to government action, and that's a report that EPA issued shortly thereafter that set the basis for the establishment of the Office of Environmental Equity, now the Office of Environmental Justice, in 1992. And of course, you know, that led to the executive order in 1994 and a whole slew of a lot of other things that the Interagency Working Group on Environmental Justice and a bunch of other things that I won't go into in a lot of detail. And it isn't only at the federal level, it's also at the state and local government level. For example, there's a 2010 report from Hastings Law School and the American Bar Association that said that found that 42 states, plus the District of Columbia and the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico, had either statutes, programs, policies, or activities around environmental justice. The third one has to do with grassroots activism. This is the first people called the Environmental Leadership Summit that brought together environmental activists, people like Bernice and others, to, for the first time, to make a statement about the fact that it was ample and robust environmental leadership in people of color communities. This is where the principles of environmental justice were codified. And these communities have gone on to achieve incredible things over the last 30 years. And that is also, taught in and of itself. However, I want to point out a couple of things that took place, and it was very much happening on a very kind of community personal level. So this is a picture of Erin Mayer. Erin Mayer was an activist, was a resident in Arbor Hill in Albany, New York, which had been cited for an incinerator. And because he would always tell me that it was because when toxic waste and race came out, it gave them a way to talk about issues that knew existed all along, which there was discrimination in the realm of the environment. And so that gave them a lot of really ample power. And this is something that I've heard from many communities across the country in terms of the same thing. Now, Erin's story is kind of interesting because, well, they did defeat the incinerator, but then some 20 years later, Erin becomes the first African-American president of the National Sierra Club. If you understand the politics of environmentalism and environmental justice and the conflict there, that's a pretty incredible statement, So, and then the last one, which, I point out because, your law students, and this is Luke Cole. Luke is a renowned and revered and beloved attorney. He has tragically passed recently, but he was the one that really kind of pioneered the idea of community lawyering, which is that you should practice law in a way that really empowers communities, something which at that time was a pretty novel idea and something that is really something that is important to be learned now as well. Well, like I said, he passed away tragically in a car accident. He's done some pretty incredible cases, which, is also something I'm not going to go into. However, the thing I want to point out is that when Luke wrote his first law journal article, he sent it to me. He said it was because of toxic waste and race, because he read that report that he decided to go into environmental justice and his field of work. So now I got to Executive Order 12898, and I'm not going to go say a lot about this. So this is the executive order that President Clinton signed in 1994 that called upon all federal agencies to identify and address its appropriate, disproportionate, high, and adverse environmental and human health effects on minority populations, low-income populations, and has set up a whole set of activities. However, I would say that it took 20 years before real real progress began to be made in terms of integrating environmental justice into the regulatory process. And that took place under the Obama administration, under this thing called Plan EJ 2014, which created for the first time a slew of basic, comprehensive suite of tools, around integrating environmental justice into EPA's programs. And, this includes things like EJ Screen, which is a national map screening and mapping tool, guidance around legal tools, guidance around rulemaking, guidance around NEPA, and so on and so forth. This is the hardest area to kind of make progress in, and I would just say we are just beginning to scratch the surface in doing this. However, I think if you go 30 years later, after toxic waste and risk, it is fair to say that we now have a very robust understanding of what environmental justice is. What happens when there's a confluence of factors in the built, natural, and social environments coming together. They produce in a very systematic way a consistent pattern of certain communities based on socioeconomic status being disproportionately impacted or more vulnerable. And we have identified the kind of impact which are identified there, as well as we have also developed a suite of proactive responses in the area of community engagement, regulatory and collaborative approaches, and analytic tools and methods. And I just want to say that last one, in terms of measures of progress, has also begun to start to make a little bit of headway. Last year, or earlier this year, EPA put out a progress report that for the first time ever published national enforcement results for its enforcement actions in areas of environmental justice concerns and the environmental benefits thereof. So that is a really big deal. And so in conclusion, I would just say that I want to go back to what I said in terms of the arcs of justice. And I want to say that, the arcs of the moral universe. Some 50 years after Dr. King made those remarks, as the first African-American president of the United States, Barack Obama, made a speech at one of the most famous environmental justice sites in the nation. And he said that while the bend of history is long, it bends towards justice, and everyone can do their part to make the world a better place. If truth be told, President Obama was himself an EJ activist, because during his youth, he was a community organizer at that location, Oakdale Gardens, which is a black housing project built on top of a toxic waste landfill in Chicago's industrialized South Side. So, this is a lot of history here and a lot of things going on, a lot of people, making all this happen. But when I started working on this, environmental justice did not have a name. Nobody knew what to call it. And so now, 30 years later, we have all this. And so these words are from on the slide, an interview I did, for the United Church of Christ to mark the 30th anniversary. And I noted in there that many people have written me, young people have written me, like Book did, and said how to profoundly influence what they want to do with their lives. So the final message I would leave you with is this, is that, a couple years ago, everybody was talking about the uncertain fate of environmental justice. They forecasted the end of environmental justice, and so on and so forth. And I would submit that, after everything you have heard in the last 30 years, that environmental justice is here to stay. Environmental justice is not going away. Environmental justice is actually doing quite well and thriving. And that for you, that it offers a way for those of you who want to. It's an area that you should look into as a way to make a difference with your lives. And so I leave you with a final quote from that interview when I was called which is entitled Conservation Race, a True Game Changer. I said probably the most meaningful things while I said that. And so so for those of you who want to make a difference, I would say that EJ issues will be local, tribal, regional, national, and international. And if you got to rise with these challenges, these are the challenges of the 21st century. We must nurture new generations of EJ leaders who are knowledgeable about how to work in both communities and in institutions armed with stellar technical and legal skills, and most important, guided by audacious vision, commitment, and spirit. And I'll leave you with that.
Great, thank you so much. Now we will hear from Bernice Miller-Travis, and she will speak on her perspectives on EJ and also comment on the impact of the 1987 report and also the role of students in the EJ movement.
Good evening, one and all. Thank you. Thank you to ELI, to the APA Civil Rights and Social Justice section, and here to law school, to the Washington College of Law. Thank you for the opportunity to continue this conversation. It's been an ongoing conversation for a very long time, and that conversation started long before Charles and the United Church of Christ came to codify it. It started long before I came to work for Charles as his research assistant. And I will just tell you one funny anecdote to start. So when we were finalizing the data, it was my job to sort of quality assure the data. So we were using EPA's existing national priorities list of hazardous waste sites, and that's sort of the backbone of the data sets that we include in the report, right? It was my job to quantify what was on their list and how many hazardous waste and toxic waste landfills were in each county in the United States. And so I was the worst friend you could have at that moment, because I would call you up and I would say, do you want to know how many hazardous waste landfills there are in your zip code? And before you could answer yes or no, I would tell you, right? And you shouldn't give people information like that unless you have a plan for what they can do about it, right? So I was freaking out everybody who knew me. And I remember having a conversation with my grandmother. My grandmother was a nurse. All four of her sisters were nurses. My mother was a nurse. So my family had this long history in science and public health. And so I said to my grandmother, you would not believe the things that we are finding out in this report. Grandma, you just wouldn't believe it. And I would just walk her through. And so she said, in response to, all this information that was pouring out of me, she said, so how much money did y'all spend at this report? I didn't exactly know, but I said, I think, somewhere in the neighborhood of $150,000 to $200,000. Charles, I don't even know if that's true. But that's the number that I pulled out, right? And my grandmother said, I am so glad I do not belong to the United Church of Christ. And I said, Grandma, how could you say such a thing? And she said, because people put their hard-earned money in those collection plates, and then they send that money to the church. And then the church decides that it's going to do a report to quantify everything that every Black person in America knows to be true. You did not need to do a report to tell folks that. And I said, well, Grandma, here's the thing. You, as a public health person, know this. You can have all the lived experience in the world, but until somebody puts it in a report and peer reviews it, it's like you didn't have it, right? So Black people, Indigenous folk, Latino folk, Asian and Pacific Islander folk have been telling this story for millennia, and nobody believed them, right? It has everything to do with the fundamental inequities in our society, the inequities in terms of mortality rates. All of it is connected to the environment and the conditions in which people live, which my grandmother, being a nurse, saw that every day when these children walked into the hospital and needed different kinds of care that were not needed in other places, in other hospitals in other jurisdictions. And so, though she was telling the truth, I felt a profound sense of gratitude to be able to take that lived experience of the folks in Warren County and so many other communities and document what their lived experience was. Now, if you look at the report, it's not the most sophisticated piece of analysis because this was 1986 and 87 when this data was being gathered. This wonderful cover that I just love. I love my cover. It's my personal cover, right? And why is it my personal cover? Because Charles gave me the assignment to take a map of the United States. So he got me a map of the United States broken down by every county, right? So it covers a 6-foot table. It was my job to take that data out of the national priorities list and transcribe that onto that map in different color codes. And then when I finished that, it took me 6 months to do that. When I finished that, I gave it to a friend of mine who was a graphic artist, and she turned my hand-coded map into this map that's on the cover. Now, how long would it take you to generate this information today? Right? It took me 6 freaking months to do this. And then GPS comes along. But, at the time, Charles and I were working on a Wang word processor. How many people in here know what a word processor is? So this is a true generational breakdown, right? This is the forerunner of personal computers, right? So we weren't even actually working on a computer. We were working on a word processor, which is kind of like an upgraded typewriter, right? And Charles, he earned that gray hair. He earned every strand of it because he worked like a crazy man on this report. So we would be in the office until, on average, 3 and 4 o'clock in the morning, on average, every day, when we were down to the last 6 months trying to get the report out the door. And Charles lived way out in Brooklyn, like the freaking end. We call it the flatlands where Charles lived. It's the end of Brooklyn, right? And the next morning at 8:30, Charles would be back at his desk slaying away at this report again. And he would call me at home and he would say, so I'm sitting at my desk, where are you? I said, I'm sleeping. And when I wake up, I will come back to the office because I just left you 4 hours ago, right? That is the level of intensity that went on. We poured our souls into this report because we knew that it meant so much to so many people to lift up what their experiences had been, but to really drive a new and different conversation about those experiences and about the kinds of decision-making that needed to happen to make sure that people were being treated equally before the law. And so essentially, fundamentally, this is about bringing equal treatment before the law, right? And in order for people to see how unequal the conditions were, we had to give them data. We had an independent firm that verified the data for us, public data access. We put the report out, and I've never seen a few pieces of paper generate the kind of buzz that this report did. And one of the places that it generated a lot of buzz was in the very community that I lived in New York. So working for Charles, I think I started working for him in the commission in July of 1986. In October of 1986, I was coerced to go to a meeting of some of my neighbors who were meeting to start this independent political organization, and it was within the confines of the Democratic Party, and I really didn't want any parts of that in New York. I'm a native New Yorker, born and raised in New York, went to college and undergrad in the same neighborhood that I grew up in at Columbia University. For all of y'all who don't know, Columbia is in Harlem. They like to tell you they're in Morningside Heights, but Morningside Heights is a community in Harlem, which is a majority people of color community. And so I go to this meeting and I walk in the door, and the people are talking about the North River Sewage Treatment Plant and how this sewage treatment plant is about to be a bane of our existence. And within 15 minutes of being in that room, it hit me like a brick. I'm doing this research about all these communities all over the United States, particularly in the Southeast United States, and it's happening right where I live, literally right where I live. And somehow they're building this giant sewage treatment plant, half a mile long, 10 stories high, designed to treat 187 million gallons of raw sewage and wastewater a day with no odor control devices. When I say it turned our lives upside down, it turned our lives upside down. But one of the things I was able to do Because I was working on this report at the time, I was able to make the connection immediately that though we were not facing hazardous waste sites, we were still facing environmental threats, and environmental threats that were placed in our midst through no agency of our own. We didn't vote on it. We didn't have any conversations about it. We weren't involved in the budgetary process of deciding where our tax dollars would go to build this giant monstrosity, which cost $1.1 billion to construct. It was the largest public works project of a non-military nature in half a century when that plant went online and when that plant was being constructed. And so I remember when the day that the reports came back to the office, stacks and stacks and stacks of them sort of sealed in plastic, and they were still warm when they got to the office. And I took 4 of them. 2 of them were for me, and 1 was for Peggy Shepard, and 1 was for Chuck Sutton, who became the co-founders with me of West Harlem Environmental Action. When I gave them their copies of the report, they were still warm. So when I said they were hot off the presses, they were hot off the presses. And we took this report and took it apart and showed in our own community, in our own context, in our own conversations with EPA Region 2, in our own conversations with the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, in our own conversations with the Justice Department, that something terribly wrong had happened here, terribly wrong. And 100,000 people were being subjected to pollution that was making it hard for them to breathe, hard for them to live in their homes, hard for them to go outside, hard for them to go to school, hard for them to live. And our conversation was just dismissed. And we continued to fight. We continued to move this agenda because we had this report to say, this is not hyperbole. The mayor of New York at the time called us screaming memes in an article in the New York Times when he was asked about, what about what these folks are saying uptown in Harlem about the air quality? There's nothing wrong with the air quality. They're just, screaming memes. So imagine, have you ever been in a public restroom and the toilet, there's one toilet that's clogged up? Is it unpleasant? Is it an unpleasant experience? So imagine, if you can, magnifying that by 187 million gallons a day. That's going through a process in the preliminary stages of the construction of the sewage treatment plant, which was a biological diversity process. So so the city of New York had been in violation of the Clean Water Act since the Clean Water Act had been passed, because all of the wastewater and raw sewage generated on the entire west side of Manhattan went straight into the Hudson River. So when I was growing up in New York in the 1960s, the lower Hudson River was a dead ecological zone. There were no fish, no plankton, no grasses, no oysters, no anything. There were no living organisms in the river around New York City. And that's because we were bombarding it with raw sewage on a daily basis, from the founding of the city until 1986 when the plant first went online. So it was a real problem and it really needed to be addressed. And I personally love the Hudson River. I grew up next to the river. The river was very, very meaningful to me and to all of us who live near the river, but we couldn't enjoy the river. So we needed a sewage treatment plant. But we also needed a sewage treatment plant that had an odor control system that would have been in place had that plant been built anywhere else. And so to make the community residents feel less annoyed, and I'll just use the word annoyed, we were catatonic. We were beside ourselves. We were so angry because we had no role in the decision making about where that plant went. So they decided that they would build a park on top of the sewage treatment plant, and that ought to make those people happy. A park that's still sitting on top of 187 million gallons of raw sewage a day. A state-of-the-art park. A park that doesn't exist anywhere else in northern Manhattan. A park with a skating rink. A park with soccer fields. A park with basketball courts, tennis courts, gardens, indoor and outdoor swimming pool, carousel, restaurants, you name it. It's all in this park on top of the sewage treatment plant. And again, I keep coming back to the report to fuel that we knew that this was horribly, horribly, horribly wrong, and that it wouldn't happen in any other place. And so as these things converged in my own life and my own work, one of the things that I remember saying to Charles so clearly, as I was looking at the data and sort of studying the data and pulling it into my head. And I remember bursting into Charles's office and said, I got it. The biggest effects that we have uncovered, and the data shows us this so clearly, because there was so much statistical significance around the relationship between race and the location of these facilities, is that this is not accidental. And we know that because statistics tells us if it happens again and again and again, and you can draw the same conclusions and you can put in the same data and get the same output, it is not a random occurrence. And that took the conversation to a whole nother level when people got the report and they saw that, you know, it really validated what people's experiences were. They knew that what was happening to them at the local level was not an accident. That someone, somebody, some entities were making decisions that would adversely affect people's lives in ways that they may never be able to recover from. In the case of our community, we eventually would partner up with the Mailman School of Public Health at Columbia University to start doing research around air quality. Turns out we had the highest rate of premature death from asthma of any community in the United States of America. In fact, any community in the Western Hemisphere, which also includes where? Mexico City, which has really bad air quality. So again, the data helped to really verify people's experience in a way that they had not had the benefit of having done heretofore. And it changed our lives. And so I had this petri dish in my own community at home in New York. So I'd go downtown to the office with Charles, and then I'd come back every evening and we would mobilize, we would have public meetings, we would talk, or I would say we would yell at the regulators to try and get them to pay attention. And I was particularly distraught by EPA Region 2, because EPA Region 2 had given the sewage treatment plant 2 findings of no significant impact. They're called FONSIs, and a FONSI is a process that EPA can do and other regulatory agencies to determine that no environmental impact assessments or statements need to be done, because they find that there's no environmental significance to what is going to happen at this facility, that it's going to be benign. And so from then until now, and I work for an environmental consulting firm, EPA is our biggest client. I work with them every day, all day. But I still cannot get past Region 2. So I actually don't work on any projects in Region 2. And folks say, Vernice, it's been 30 years. You need to let it go. And I say, I'm trying, but I remember all the funerals that I went to. All the funerals of people who died before their time. All the people who were maimed. All the people who were harmed irreparably with respiratory diseases. All the people who would never live to be the ripe old age that they should have lived to be. All the children who couldn't go to school and perform because they were dealing with serious asthma issues. And I think about all the communities like mine across the United States who have had this experience, who have lived with this experience, and who have borne that experience, while people have constantly said to them, your experience is not real. There's no data. There's no evidence, to verify what you're talking about. So what this report did for not just my community, but communities around the country, was to validate their experience in a way that had never happened before then. And so when Charles says that, people call him, or they run into him, or they see him speaking places and they tell him how this report has changed their lives, I hear the same thing all over the place. And so I've spent a lot of time over the last 30 years talking to lots of law students and lots of undergraduate students, and especially students in land use planning, which is my field. And I try to help people understand how powerful data can be to tell the narrative of what people's experience have been, so that policies can be changed and or enacted to really bring equal treatment before the law to every community. And so I've spent the last 30 years doing that. I will spend the rest of my time doing that. But I've said this to Charles, and he gets very sheepish when I say it, but you should all have the experience, hopefully, once in your life, when you are presented with a body of work and information, and you step up to the plate, and you take on that body of work, and it changes the course of your life. That's what happened to me. Thank you, Charles.
Right now, we will hear from Professor Rosser, and he will speak about tribal sovereignty and grassroots movements in Native American communities.
Great, and let me just start with a brief note about the report. I did not come to this knowing anything. I sort of feel like a fraud even being here. My mother would be a great panelist. My mother spent her career doing Navajo Superfund, Navajo EPA. My wife would be a pretty good panelist. She did the master's program at SIS on global environmental politics and worked for a number of environmental groups. I did none of those things, but it does sound like the two of us have a similar parent. Whenever I write anything, my father says, I already knew that. I'm looking forward to at some point contributing in a way that he recognizes. I think I want to say a couple things, and I'll be brief. This is where I'm from. I'm from near Shiprock. For those of you who haven't been, this is in the second Transformers movie, but it's a lovely location and it's near my father today. The challenge when it comes to tribes is was most presented to me when I was at this public interest environmental conference. Some of you have probably been. There's a sort of, I would call it the feel-good environmental conference that Oregon hosts, and you go there, everyone's on the same side. The students, you know, what they want from the presenter is who is the most radical environmentalist of the group. And I was presenting from the tribal side, and I sat down with the panel, and the panelists, we were both talking about the same issue, which is the tribe's proposal for a coal-fired power plant. And the first speaker was the attorney opposing the power plant. I was more the academic, and he said, let me get started by saying sovereignty isn't real. And then I didn't know what to do with that. So there was a blogger that wrote out the conference notes, and they said the first speaker was great. Professor Rosser seemed a little confused. And that was my reaction to it, because to start out with a position to not take sovereignty seriously struck against what I believed in and what I thought needed to be dealt with, even in an environmental justice context. And even in an environmental justice context, talking about something as big and as bad as a coal-fired power plant. So I think the first thing to start with is just that tribes are not the same. There's a wide range in tribes and their experience and what they're facing. I happen to know one tribe, the Navajo Nation, pretty well. The Navajo Nation, I grew up in part there, but I am not Navajo. I'm not going to make the same mistake Elizabeth Warren has made. I'm aware of what she did. And I'm not going to do that. The Navajo Nation, the Navajos have a word for people like me. It's Biligana, and Biligana means white, the other, or the enemy. And I think that that is a fair description of what I am. The Navajos also, for a long time, and this came out of the word Churchill, he described the Navajo Nation as the national sacrifice zone because of what was being done to the reservation, in particular uranium mining, but also the coal-fired power plants. So what happened for the reservation was once transmission lines got good enough, you could put the harms of energy production a long way removed from the non-Indian consumption of that in Phoenix, Albuquerque, Las Vegas, and Los Angeles, and sort of hide the problems of that production and impose all of that harm on the reservation. I think the challenge with tribes and with sovereignty when it comes to environmental justice is in some ways EPA really was a leader and deserves credit for taking sovereignty seriously. And so EPA, while I have written about some of the concerns I have about the EPA stance that tribes should be treated as a state, compared to many other administrative agencies, that is a great position to have and opened up the space for other agencies to make progress on treatment of tribes. It's not without problem, and I think part of the challenge when it comes to poor communities is this idea that there is a one position when it comes to environmental justice. My own, and I'll be brief about this, Yeah, but you could see this in some of the proposals that the tribes have dealt with and have come out with results that non-Indians may not like. Non-Indians, especially environmentalists, may not like. So the current head of the museum here in DC, when he was an attorney, he advocated on behalf of turning a reservation into a dump for the city of San Diego. That was his position. It didn't happen, but there was a very real push on it and done through a sovereignty lens. Another more recent example, the Gashute Indian tribe wanted to turn their entire reservation into an above-ground nuclear storage facility. I like to joke with students in my property class, if you want to figure out how to make the most money off of your land, it's hard to beat above-ground nuclear storage, but it's problematic, right? So, and the Navajos, I think that one of the challenges that doesn't get attention is in the 1920s and 30s, the United States government engaged in a program of forced livestock reduction, essentially wiping out the wealth of many tribal members unilaterally in a way that is just clearly wrong. But the trauma of that event has meant that the tribe since then has been largely incapable of figuring out grazing in a way that will protect the environment. So there are these real challenges. I think the last point I'll leave with is for tribes, it's important to recognize that tribes have internal divisions as well. So some tribes, the leadership may want one thing and tribal members may want another. And I think as a society going through the Trump years, we have to recognize that just as we have internal conflicts, they do as well. It doesn't, though, undercut sovereignty. If anything, it just shows that sovereignty for tribes is complicated, just like my relationship to the United States government right now is complicated. So I'll stop there.
Yeah. So we will now turn to Professor Snape, and he will discuss the impact of fossil fuel extraction on environmental justice communities.
Well, it is a true pleasure to be here, and I did not grow up on an Indian reservation. I am a white boy who grew up in the suburbs. And I think that my understanding of environmental justice hopefully has a little bit to do with just my general maturity and sense of empathy as I've gotten older, but it's actually born from experience as well. I was speaking with my friend and colleague Adrian Hollis, who's in the audience, and we have a very similar take on the climate movement. The climate movement, which I'm a part of, trying to reduce and hopefully eliminate the amount of greenhouse gases that we emit as a society, I've come to realize can only succeed if we have every community and every person participating in the solution and identifying the problem. And for many years, it really was sort of a white group, white person, we'll think of a solution and we'll hand it down. In fact, for those of you that have a little bit of a memory, just 10 years ago, the Waxman-Markey bill, two great congressmen, Waxman and Markey, very progressive congressmen, they had a climate bill when President Obama took office, and it did pass the House, and it failed miserably in the Senate, and it really never went anywhere. And it really never went anywhere because the communities and people, I can see Bernice nodding her head over the corner of my eye, were totally not involved in that legislative solution, totally opposed it the more they got to know about it. And so really what I want to do today is talk about the climate battle through the environmental justice lens that has been presented to me. It was already there, but I finally opened my eyes and was able to see it. A quick note about just climate justice in general before I get to my case study in California. Upwards of 150 million people on this planet are climate refugees. Bangladesh, Africa, Syria. And of course, we're learning that in the United States we have climate refugees. From Houston last year, the Carolinas, just recently, Florida, Puerto Rico, thank you very much, the Maldives, everywhere, where climate hits and these disasters are hitting, are creating this human suffering. And it's usually the people that are the poorest, usually people of color, that are most impacted by these catastrophes and by the general onslaught of climate change. And so I want to talk about California as my case study. I could talk on and on and on, but I'd be kicked underneath the table if I did that. We want to get to the question and answer. But I do have a story to tell about California. And I'll start with Jerry Brown. Jerry Brown is an interesting guy, a governor, second time around in California. He also has overseen one of the most expansive oil drilling booms in California history. It's not known about him, even as he's battling Trump on "we're still in Paris and we still fight for climate." Governor Jerry Brown has overseen a dramatic increase in oil drilling in that state. And I don't have the pretty pictures, unfortunately, to show you, but if I did, they would very clearly show that the vast majority of these oil wells and these drilling operations are in places where people of color and poor people live. Upwards of 3/4 of the drills and wells are in areas where such people live. Now, we're not just talking, a few chemicals here and there. 98 million pounds of chemicals in Los Angeles County alone between June 2013 and February 2017. That's 98 million pounds of chemicals used to extract the oil from these wells. And so the story I want to tell is a story of a group called the Youth for Environmental Justice and the South Central Youth Leadership Coalition actually suing the city of Los Angeles a few years ago to stop what the city was doing, which was rubber stamping all of these oil permit applications by the oil industry. And so these groups sued. I think the city of Los Angeles quickly realized that they were absolutely in violation of the law, and so they entered into a settlement to stop the administrative practice of just rubber stamping these oil well applications, these drilling applications. And that was all going well and fine until the California Independent Petroleum Association decided that not only would they intervene, but they would file their own lawsuit against the Youth Environmental Justice Organization, claiming that their due process rights had been infringed upon because now the county was changing its administrative practice of processing these permits. Now, Professor Rosser teaches property. He's taught me a lot of what I know about property because I teach property now. For those that don't remember property law, local governments need to have the ability to regulate these police powers, public health and safety issues. There is no governmental interest. There's no societal interest, a property interest for a oil company to say that just because they might lose a few dollars, that somehow their due process has been implicated. Those are ridiculous arguments. But as it turns out, a Superior Court judge in California agreed with those arguments, would not uphold a motion to throw out the petroleum lawsuit, which is essentially a slap lawsuit. And so this December, before a state court, California Court of Appeals, there will be a lawsuit, there will be a hearing to decide whether this lawsuit by the California Petroleum Association is a slap suit, whether it was brought only to sort of harass the local citizens who were just trying to protect the areas where they live, exactly the types of things Bernice was talking about. And so it's not just enough that the Youth for Environmental Justice actually have to file a lawsuit, find a lawyer, spend a lot of money to stop the pollution. Now they have to defend the lawsuit against the very industry that wrought that pain and that suffering in the first place. And so these battles can be vicious. They go on for years. The law students in the room and the lawyers in the room, we're going to train you well so that you can win those battles, but they are not for the faint of heart, as my little example shows. And I'll just end with what I hope is trite and cliche, but I so believe it to be true, which is the reason I now believe in environmental justice, beyond the fact that I know it's right in my heart and it's the moral right thing to do, that there will be no climate justice, there will be no environmental justice unless there's economic justice and social justice and racial justice and just doggone human justice. And I've come to learn as an old man that those values are intertwined in ways that cannot be separated. We will only solve these macro issues of climate change and mega environmental deterioration if we empower all the people to fight against them. And I'm just so appreciative to be able to talk about this today with all of you, and I'll just end it there.
So at this time, we are going to enter our question and answer period, and we will have questions that are coming from the GoToWebinar, and I will repeat the questions that Caitlin will share. And if you have questions, please raise your hand and we will get them answered. So I will start. So let's start right here since you're standing.
Thank you. Yeah. So I want to bring up this interconnection, intersectionality that we miss often And that's the relationship between climate justice, climate change, environmental issues, and military spending. I don't think there is any way in hell that we can deal with the climate issue as long as we spend in excess of $700 billion on the military. That's the only place that the money for the changes we need to make can come from. The fact that literally every Democratic senator voted for this catastrophic budget should be alarming to everybody. And I think we need to fully integrate this conversation. Otherwise, we're not going to go.
Thank you. So that was a comment for those.
No, I welcome any.
Right. So I have to repeat it so that everybody can hear it. So that was a question about the intersectionality of climate change and military spending. So if there's anyone who would like to address that, speak to some budgetary issues.
Well, one thing is that next to EPA, and used to be the Department of Energy. I'm not sure how much they spend on climate-based research, and the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. The Department of Defense is the agency that is spending a truckload of money on preparedness based on climate vulnerability. And even though there's an administration in place that does not believe that climate change is real and is shifting a lot of federal funding away from it, the Department of Defense is fighting to keep that budget in place. And why is that? Because their personnel are being harmed. So right now, there are 3 military bases that have been inundated by Hurricane Florence. Several that were impacted by Katrina, others that were impacted by Sandy. So many bases in North Carolina and South Carolina that were impacted last year. This is a real threat to military preparedness for them. And so they're just diving in and doing the research. If your question is that we could do a lot more with the money that we spend on military preparedness and the military budget, that is true for every issue in this country, right? It's true for how we fight poverty or even acknowledge it. It's true for how we provide health services. It's true for how we educate our children. It's true for how we do environmental protection, how we regulate our food supply. Everything could be better. It could be better resourced if not for all the money that we spend on the military budget and defense. But I don't think we're going to win that argument. You know, I would like to say that, just by the people rising up, we're going to shift the military budget. That ain't going to happen. But knowing that the Department of Defense is deeply engaged in climate research and readiness and preparedness, both globally in terms of conflict aversion and how that comes up in the context of climate change and climate impact, as well as preparedness for communities here in the United States. I'd rather be working with them than be trying to have a battle with them about whether or not they should have the budget that they have. I believe that their budget should be less, but I know that there's some battles that I can't win. That's one of them, right? I can win, I think, a battle about equity and justice and the moral rightness of that. But I don't think I can win a conversation right now in this country at this moment that we should severely limit their budget. I would love to do it, but it's not going to happen. So if it's not going to happen, and if they're doing the research, how can we work together? And how can we get them to spend some of that money to work on preparedness at the most local level, not just in their bases, but outside their bases, right? So if they're going to be safe, then how about all the people who live near them be safe as well? That would be my approach at this moment. One day, I hope we can severely reduce their budget because there's so much less of a need for war and military incursion. And I hope that will happen in my lifetime, but it's not going to happen in 2018.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for this panel. First, in reference to the question about military spending, as a military spouse, I would say that even right now, with the current hurricane that just hit Florida, it hit over 3 bases.
Yep.
And one thing to consider in this debate, if that's coming into it, is that also a disproportionate number of our enlisted men and women also come from these communities. So there's a lot of opportunity to be able to coordinate there in a collaborative way. My question for you is, I work with the Natural Resources Defense Council, and for case. I hear amazing things about you. They still talk about you in the halls. But as you know better than anyone, NRDC and a lot of the elite environmental organizations are still very white, and sometimes at the very highest levels. And there are risks within the environmental community. What are steps that people in positions such as at NRDC, EDF, Sierra Club, the law students here who want to join those kinds of organizations can do to give the proper space for the EJ movement to make sure that it gets the voice that it needs?
Wow. What a great question.
Can I just start? Do you need to repeat that? Go ahead, Kendra.
So the question was, what are steps that individuals can take to ensure that there are voices, right?
That are individuals within the mainstream environmental and elite organizations.
So I'm not sure I have an answer for your macro question. It's a doozy, as you know, but I will just say from my anecdotal experience at the Center for Biological Diversity, but other groups as well, including NRDC, that over the last decade, there has been an absolute sea change in how it is these organizations view who are their employees, who their leaders are. And I grant you that at the upper CEO levels, it's still pretty white and still pretty male. I don't disagree with that. But at least at the Center for Biological Diversity, because of these California fracking battles, because of the border wall issues more involved, we have to have people from the community representing us and representing those people. So I've actually seen just an incredible change in the groups realizing they can't win the battles by just being a certain way. And I don't be Pollyanna about that and say that it's all hunky-dory great, but I do see change. I do see an acknowledgement of that issue, and I do believe in the next 10 years we'll see even more change there. And it's a good thing, a really good thing.
So, boy, this is the conundrum of my life, right? I'm in the mainstream environmental movement, and I've, been in the EJ movement from day one, and, some days the battle would be going on inside my head while I sat at my desk. Where NRDC is today is light years away from where it was when I went to work here in 1993 as the Director of Environmental Justice at NRDC. I had to convince a lot of my colleagues that this was valid work. So again, not just this report, but the many iterations of toxic waste and waste, right? So there's toxic waste and waste revisited, there's toxic waste and waste at 20, there's a plethora of other research out there, but having to convince my colleagues that this is real and that people suffering needed their intervention and their leadership was a real hard pill to swallow on many days. On the other hand, Charles had a picture up in a slide of the signing of the executive order on environmental justice. You couldn't see me because I was standing behind John Conyers, Congressman John Conyers, who's 6 feet tall and I'm 5'2", and you can see my hair, but you couldn't see me. But I was there, and I was there because I work for NRDC and I work on the development of the executive order on environmental justice as a staff person at NRDC. And there's no question in my mind that the reason that I was in that space is because Vice President Gore was connected to NRDC, and they said, well, we happen to have this person who works on EJ. Maybe, she might have something to share about that process. We are in a place and a state, and it's making a lot of people upset about the demographic changes that are going on in our country. Get the hell over it, right? Because it's here and it's moving, right? So, just one statistic that the mainstream environmental community, I think, is coming to accept. 50% of the Latino community is under the age of 15, 50%, right? So in 3 years, those folks are going to be able to vote, right? In 6 years, they'll be in school. In 10 years, they'll be drivers of policy at the local level and wherever else they choose to go. You can continue to have sort of a white bastion of privilege that talks about environmental policy, or you can get on the train with everybody else and move in the same direction. Waxman Markey was a classic example of a group of folks that got together and said, we think this is what climate policy and change and governance and legislative advocacy needs to look like. We are the ones who know what to do, and this is what you should do. The Congressional Black Caucus voted against it, right? The Hispanic Caucus voted against it. Why? Because we asked them to vote against it. Because we were not in the room. We were not in the conversation. We had no role in laying out that piece of legislation, and it died on the floor, and it should have died on the floor. And now we're in a different place. And maybe this moment that we're in, while it's kind of tragic and it's kind of threatening for those of us who believe in environmental policy and environmental protection and human rights and social justice and racial justice and economic justice and all the other things we believe in that the people in the White House clearly do not believe in, this moment will pass. And then we will come to another point when, as a nation, we have to decide how we're moving forward domestically and how we're moving forward globally. And in order to have common cause with other folk, we're going to have to articulate some policy and put forward some people that look like the people in the rest of the world. We're already here, and you can't stop that wave from coming. And I know people are doing every desperate thing they can to try and stop it, but it cannot be stopped, right? And so the question is, are we going to move together? Are we going to move into the 21st century? Are we going to spend this last 10 years that the IPCC report of last week told us we have and do good things and articulate good policy and make good budgetary decisions? Or are we going to go down in flames, right? I'm not trying to go down in flames. I'm trying to move us all forward collectively. And we are at that point. We are at the tipping point. And the tipping point says that we can't be who we were. We got to be something different. Or nobody's going to vote for us and nobody's going to stand for us when we come and say there's a climate crisis. We need to do something about it. So I think we are at that point where the barrel is against your temple. And, you know, either you pay attention to reality or you go down in flames. And I'm not trying to die like that. You know, I'm trying to die standing up and fighting.
So I think the point that Bill made about the kind of changes that's taking place in environmental organizations is really real, you know, but there's a long way to go, you know, and, you know, I think recent reports like, you know, the Green 2.0 kind of pointed out, so I'm not going to go into that. I just think that there's one place where if they were truly serious about this, the environmental organizations would take upon themselves to proactively do something about the issue of the imbalance of funding. Mm-hmm. So all the money, all the resources go to these national organizations. They believe that they're doing it for a good cause, and they don't realize that what that's happening, what that's doing is just sucking the resources away from the grassroots organizations, which are just trying to survive on a shoestring, you know. So, you know, the fundamental issue in terms of the imbalances that exist in terms of environmentalism is funding. And so, you know, if people are really truly serious about diversity and really making sure that there's a space created for, you know, the communities that are most marginalized and most impacted, they would proactively, you know, they don't, I mean, proactively, you know, set up something to make sure that those resources, there's some resources diverted. So they could be a little bit smaller, but the whole movement will be a lot bigger, you know?
Sir, in your question right here. Let me just say one little thing about this funding issue, which is so important. So in 2000, I went to work at the Ford Foundation to launch an environmental justice portfolio there. And I have to tell you, it was every day. I had stacks of letters coming in from my colleagues in the mainstream environmental movement. We know you're going to fund us for this. I'm like, yeah, no, I'm not. Because this ain't for you. This is about growing the grassroots environmental justice movement. But here in this administration, Dr. Hollis had the experience. Dr. Hollis directs our federal policy office for We Act for Environmental Justice here in DC. And she shared a story that an environmental group who I will not name, who I like very much and used to be my grantee, reached out to her to say, we have so much money coming in the door that we don't know what to do with it. So we're hoping that you can help us figure out how to get some of this money to grassroots groups. Ain't nobody calling We Act for Environmental Justice and saying, we got so much money that's coming in the door that we need to give it to you so that you can continue to do the work that you're doing. Even in this moment of environmental peril, the difference between where the money is going and who's getting it is so stark, and it just continues to perpetuate that inequity. People are doing a lot of things with very little resource, but Charles is right. If people wanted to really make a statement, they would make the statement at the point of where are the resources going, and how can they more equitably be driven into the places that are the most vulnerable, but have the least resource to address the problem.
Great, thank you. We're going to take one here and one here.
Yes.
Hi guys, my name is Andrew Ureta. I'm a 3L here at the law school, and my question's for the panel. Notwithstanding the 1994 executive order, should there be federal statute requiring agencies to undergo kind of a environmental justice analysis? And if so, would it be effective?
Well, the answer to that will be yes. I mean, I think that you know, not having a statute is really a barrier, right? But the thing is this, you know, having a statute that doesn't say anything isn't bad, right? You know, so the thing is you know, most statutes at the state level around environmental justice are procedural, right? Just like the executive order is procedural, right? So the question of, you know, how do you make sure that these things are addressed in substantive ways? I mean, the only place where that's actually happening is a kind of legislation that's taking place in California. There's a whole slew of that in terms of environmental justice, like recognition of cumulative impact, requirement for cumulative impact to be addressed in permits, you know, the declaration that, you know, water as a human right, you know, the establishment of a community air toxics program. You know, you can go on down the line. You know, SB 1000, the requirement that that environmental justice be an element or a major consideration in a general plan, right? All these things, you know, these are substantive, right? So in the politics of California and the politics of the Washington D.C. are kind of different, right? So you know, so the thing is that, you know, you got to think about what it all may mean, right? And how you do it. Now, going back to all this, you know, everybody says, well, we got to get an EJ analysis. Well, you know, I think we do, but the question isn't so much that. I mean, the question is that, but also the question is, you know, an understanding of the regulatory and decision frame around which you're going to integrate decision-making, environmental justice considerations into. See, that's the, you know, because, you know, a lot of people come and say, you know, if only we had a great EJ analysis, and that EJ analysis would be just like the rest of the EJ conversation, which by many of the people in position of decision making, which is that you put it on the side and you never pay any attention to it. So it is bringing these things together. So that's not that simple, right? That's why I said, you know, when it came to the executive order and taking it and actually starting to make progress on the regulatory side in government decision making, that's hard. That's the hardest part of all of this. So this is a long card. It's a great question. Answer is definitely yes, but it isn't just yes. It's what, right? And so that's a long conversation.
So there is a piece of legislation that exists, that has existed since 1964. It's called the Civil Rights Act of 1964. In the Civil Rights Act is a title called Title VI. You know, like Title IX, right? Title IX is Title IX of what? Everybody forgets that. They just talk about Title IX and Title 10 as if it's floating out there somewhere in the ether. It's Title IX and Title 10 of the Civil Rights Act, right? Title 6 of the Civil Rights Act says you cannot be, in fact, it's very interesting. This lawsuit that was argued in the Supreme Court today about Harvard's affirmative action program really is a fundamental challenge and question to Title VI, right? And Title VI says that you cannot be a recipient of federal dollars and use those dollars or expend those dollars in any way that adversely impacts protected groups of people as defined by the Civil Rights Act of 1964. There's only one agency that seems to understand, well, two, that seem to understand what Title VI means, and that's the Department of Justice and the Department of Education. Right now, the Department of Education is on a vacation. In fact, most agencies, offices of civil rights are on vacation. But at EPA, the Office of Civil Rights was permanently on vacation until the Obama administration. And it took incredible pressure from environmental justice advocates, civil rights attorneys, environmental attorneys, pressuring the Obama administration every single day until the Wednesday before President Obama left office, when they finally rolled out their new protocols and practices for how to do a Title VI investigation. Now, why would it take you from 1970, when the agency was formed, until 2017 to figure out how to operationalize a program? The Department of Justice said you have to, every agency that gives federal money has to have a program. And that's because the battle was inside the agency itself, that did not believe that, one, environmental racism was real, and that racism has anything to do with the mission of EPA or fighting racism. So the fight was inside the agency, and it's inside many agencies, but there is legislation. And if only they would step up and enforce it. It's not a panacea, but it certainly gets you much further down the line than we are now. We don't have to fight with the opposing forces in Congress. We just have to impact and influence and enforce an existing piece of legislation that we've had for a very long time. And if you all haven't studied the Civil Rights Act, you really need to, because it's one of the most comprehensive, beautifully and deftly crafted pieces of federal legislation that touches a wide swath of how we live in our community, if only it were enforced and believed in, right?
Can I just give a footnote to that very powerful answer?
Good job.
In essence, it's thanks to ELI, Senate Bill 1996 by Cory Booker. He was actually at the first of these 3 sessions on environmental justice, has some of the review procedures, and I think would actually make Title VI a little more enforceable as well. So that's 1996 for those who want.
Hank Wallace of Right and Speak Like the News. How do you recruit among civil rights lawyers and others to show that EJ is cool as working on voter suppression, alleged police brutality, public schools?
Wow.
Besides the great recruiting you're doing with this uplifting panel.
Oh, Josh, do you want
Well, before the real experts gear up, let me just say that my story showed that it just presented itself, because here we were fighting a fight that we thought was one fight, and we realized it was a much bigger, multi-pronged fight. So I think in some ways my anecdote, while not the entire story, I think is a part of the story. We're fighting existing battles. You're fighting, maybe losing, maybe win, but you realize you can only capital W win if you actually have that approach, because in Southern California, we only got the city of Los Angeles to back off because thousands of residents were sick and not able to go to school or work. So I think in part of it, you have to just integrate this stuff, but I'm sure there's a more intelligent answer than that.
Well,
I'm sorry to say, but we may have to take that answer to the reception afterwards.
All right.
Because our time is up, so just a couple of points. I'm Scott Badnock. I'm the co-chair of the Environmental Justice Committee of the ABA's Section for Civil Rights and Social Justice, which is a mouthful, and a visiting attorney at ELI. I want to first thank ELI for the incredible work they do putting these events together. Thank you to Washington College of Law, Peel, amazing program. Thank you to Beverage and Diamond for sponsoring this reception. We could not do these events without firms like theirs. And if you like this programming and you're interested in this sort of thing, join the EJ committee at the ABA, become a member of ELI, get engaged. There's a lot to be done. There's a lot of groups that are facilitating this work. When we leave this room, there are students right outside the door, if you don't know your way around here, that are going to guide us to the atrium so we can have a drink and continue the conversation. Thank you all for attending. We really appreciate it and look forward to the next event. It will be soon.